from having achieved peace, consolidation, and undisputed kingship in France by 1494, Charles then embarked on a project of the conquest of Naples, which both totally destabilized Italy for the next 75 years, and also was a real detriment to French economic and political fortunes for the next several decades. Why did he do it? Charles's motives. Well, if you look at where Naples is, Charles thought this would be a great base for launching a crusade against the Ottoman Empire. He wanted to do this in part because of worries about the incursions of the Ottoman Empire, because of his true faith as a Catholic, but also because he wanted to be the leader of Catholic Europe rather than Maximilian up here in the Holy Roman Empire. So he was thinking of Naples as a launching point for a crusade which would make him preeminent in Europe as well as protect Europe from the Ottomans. He was also motivated by his opportunities. As it turned out at this point, these territories were all intensely competitive rivals, not just economically against each other, but also militarily against each other. In particular, the Duchy of Milan, the Republic of Venice, the Republic of Florence, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples were pretty much at each other's throats on a regular basis. So the rivalries were intense, and there were two things that made it so that it was possible to think about taking over the Kingdom of Naples. We'll get back to those in a second. He did successfully occupy Naples, and we'll talk about how that happened, why that happened. But the reactions in the long term were detrimental both to the Italian peninsula and also to France, as I said. All right, so in addition to the intense permanent state of rivalry between these states in the Italian peninsula, there were in particular actors at this moment. First of all, the Pope, Alexander VI, who was concerned to act as a territorial prince to defend his territories here and to preserve a balance of power between all of these rivals and shifting groups of alliances up here, but also because he was concerned as a father, as the founder of a dynasty himself, to establish territories for his son, Caesar Borgia, to administer as a princeling in his own right. So he had territorial motivations and dynastic motivations as an Italian prince, just like all the other Italian princes. There was Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, up here, who was thinking in particular about how best to maintain the balance of power between Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, all of these areas, so not one of them got too powerful. Ferdinand of Aragon, who as King of Spain also dynastically had ruled Sicily as part of his territories and had a bit of a claim to the Kingdom of Naples dynastically, which was being ruled by his in-law Alfonso of Naples at the time of this, when this conflict all started. All right, how did it start? Two things. Down in the south, Alfonso died, and the question of who was to be next as the ruler of Naples became a question of whether it was going to be a candidate from Aragon or the French candidate, Charles VIII. As it turns out, remarkably enough, the Kingdom of Naples was a fiefdom of the Pope. So technically the Pope was the person who could name the next ruler. Charles VIII appealed to the Pope the Pope said, "Oh sure, as soon as Alfonso dies, you can be the next ruler of Naples." But then once Alfonso did die, Pope Alexander did not follow through on that promise and grant the territory to Charles. He granted it to Alfonso's successor, son, in the direct line of that family. So Charles felt aggrieved by this promise that he thought he had from the Pope, that the Pope then reneged on. And at the same time as he had that grievance about the assignment of the Kingdom of Naples, Ludovico Sforza invited him in to invade Naples in order to redress the balance of power up here in the north, particularly to worry Venice and Florence over the question of their relative power, because he thought it would make a good counterweight. So, on his invitation, Charles VIII invaded Italy in 1494. And with that action, Ludovico Sforza inaugurated this long, long era of foreign intervention in the affairs of Italy. Particularly since, once Charles had marched into Italy as King of France, then Ferdinand of Aragon could claim Naples in the Spanish line and land troops there as well. So from this point on, more often than not, Italy is occupied by troops from first Italy and Spain, and then eventually France and Spain, and then eventually from troops from France and the Holy Roman Empire. All right, well, so how did it go? As Knecht points out, after the initial successful occupation of Naples, Charles, and this is totally medieval, could not maintain himself there. He could not raise an army that was big enough and permanent enough to occupy Naples long term. He had to be done with campaigning at the end of the season. He went back home, and as it turned out, could not come back the next year for the next campaign because he couldn't raise the money. His baby son had just died, and he himself shortly thereafter died. So all of the gains in warfare of the medieval period always ran this risk of being impermanent because of the costs and the vagaries of maintaining an occupying army. Having said that, one of the ways he won the battles he did win is because he had invested in the new technology of the 1400s, which was cannons. Up until now, of course, the way wars were fought were through an infantry usually armed by bows and by swords, and a cavalry on horseback, armed with swords and lances mostly. In the 1400s, you see the introduction of gunpowder, the development of musketry for the infantry, but most importantly, the development of cannons and massed cannons as artillery, which only monarchs are rich enough to be able to afford. Cannons are expensive. And so the cannons became not just the way that Charles initially won on the Italian peninsula by having the largest and most effective artillery at the time. They're also a marker of the modernization of warfare, because from this point out, the artillery is critical to battles in Europe between monarchs. It is also critical to the rise of kings, because a king with an artillery, if he encounters a rebel noble, can simply drag his cannon up, surround the noble's castle where he's holding out as a rebel, and level the castle. He doesn't have to besiege it anymore for months and months and months. So artillery becomes a marker of modernity and a marker of the rising military effectiveness of monarchs against their own nobles. So what's the result for France? Well, after that initial success, it's a black eye, it's expensive, it's embarrassing to have to retreat and not be able to come back. For Spain, it means a long-term commitment in the Italian peninsula as well, and at this point the potential for success there in Naples. For Italy, it's the beginning of a 70-year catastrophe. This is the period in which Machiavelli was writing, the 1490s, and he is writing from the perspective of seeing what a fatal mistake it was for the fortunes of Italian states for Ludovico Sforza to have invited foreign intervention as a means of winning in the local regional disputes of the Italian city-states. So Machiavelli is writing The Prince in light of this terrible era of warfare and division and shifting alliances and all-out bloodshed on the Italian peninsula. And of course, last but not least, as Knecht points out, one of the results that was bad for France, but then bad for Europe generally of the invasion of Naples, was that the invading mercenaries brought back with them to their various territories all over Europe the disease that was rampant in Naples at the time, which was syphilis, and this marks the introduction of syphilis into the list of dire diseases to which Europeans were subject for centuries thereafter.